We're all probably familiar with this map from the front of our school atlases, you know, the biogeographical zones of the world. And that's what the Earth would look like in terms of its vegetation patterns without us. So if we weren't on the planet, those are under the current climatic conditions, those are the biogeographical zones that we would see. However, a chap that I know, a guy called Earl Ellis, who runs the Center for the Anthropocene in the US, has used historical data to backcast, if you like, to recreate the land cover patterns in 1700 rolling forward. And if you look along the bottom, the colours at the bottom is a key, which shows you've got settlement and villages, and croplands, rangelands, semi-natural wildlands. And then above that's a kind of proportional bar, how much of the world's land surface is used, semi-wild or wild. Keep an eye on that as I just flip forward through 1800 and at the colours on the map, the 1900 and then 2000. So we are using up the planet. And underpinning this is what we call human appropriation of net primary productivity, or HAMP. It's just a fancy word to say how much of the Earth's resources we're using to grow food, to create timber, etc., etc. And notice how much wild is still left. And there are global maps. I have some criticism about these maps, but they do generally show a good pattern. So the green end of the spectrum is the wilderness end, and the red end or the black end of the spectrum is the areas which the human footprint is large. So think of this as a percentage of the impact of humans on the planet. And of course you can take the top 10% of each of those biogeographical zones and identify the last of the wild. Look at England, Scotland, Wales. Yeah, it's white, there's nothing there. However, it depends on the window at which you observe, and so I'll come back to this in a minute. But a guy called James Watson and his team have written a lot of papers based on this work, actually calculated that in the last 20 years we've lost 10% of the world's wild areas, just over the last 20 years. And that's really worrying. So what about wild places? And I've stolen this quote from a recent JMT document, which just explains that it's the existence of these wild spaces which allows us to appreciate the extraordinary complexity of wild nature and its beauty, the aesthetics that that inspire us, and that's a legacy that we need to pass on. And that's where the work of the Trust plays a very strong part. Now, I'm a geographer, obviously. I come from a geography background. And I was talking to William earlier this morning about geography just being colouring in. And I do a lot of GIS computer mapping. That's my thing. And I said, yeah, that's advanced colouring in. So I'm going to show you some computer maps and stuff that we've worked on. But the problem is with protecting wild is intrinsically we all know what we're talking about. We all have experienced wild places. We're able to talk about that probably down the pub or over breakfast or whatever we're talking to people about that enjoyment that we've got from it, the inspiration, the value that we place on it. But politicians, developers, economists, planners and things, they don't understand those kinds of terms necessarily in their work. They understand numbers and lines on maps. And so my career, as much as it is, has been trying to develop approaches which allow us to put a line on a map and say it's here. And that's where the defensive line is. And latterly working in the rewilding front and actually trying to create space for more. And I tried to split it down into both the biophysical, the natural processes that govern the world, and our perceptions of that. So natural processes versus natural landscapes. This is just, it's just a picture, but it's a nice picture. It's the twin sisters, the three sisters wilderness in the United States. And a lot of my work is focused on mapping wilderness qualities and characters based on this thing called the wilderness continuum. So at the left-hand side of that continuum, think of that as a one-dimensional map, is urban areas. and on the right-hand side we have wilderness. And in between there are gradations of wild, depending on that human footprint, those maps that we were just looking at. And if we're able to map the elements of human impact, such as modification of land cover, building structures in the landscape, be they wind turbines or roads or railways or whatever, the ruggedness of the landscape, and how remote we are from the nearest point of mechanised access. In other words, how long it takes us to walk into there. Then we're going some way towards being able to map those things. And so I've been able to map wilderness quality or wildness quality at very fine resolutions using techniques which are robust, they're reliable, repeatable, and they're rigorous, such that they stand up to scrutiny of the planners, the politicians, the developers, and the economists. So the numbers that we generate and the lines on the maps are defensible. So we've done work at the European scale. For the European Union, that's our version 1 map. We've now produced another one which includes the whole of continental Europe. And these are the 2 national parks on the left there, Cairngorm and Loch Lomond and Trossachs, where we are now. Now, the Wild Places Index, which John Muir Trust is in the process of developing, they've taken, correct me if I'm wrong here, these 45 areas to try to identify the wild places that are important within these areas. Now, the reason I put this funny hexagon map on there is that I think it's a good starting point is using the landscape regions, but they are at the mercy of the boundaries drawn. So, you know, this thing called the modifiable area of the unit problem. I don't want to get too geeky, but if you change the boundaries, you change the results. The numbers change when you start changing the boundaries. It's like population density mapping within the census units. So a more robust approach might be to use hexagon maps. Hexagons because they tessellate, but they're the closest to a circle, and a circle is the most compact geometric shape, but of course they don't tessellate. So a hexagon is perhaps the way forward here, I think, in terms of mapping all of the wildest places in each of the hexagons, which might approximate to a reasonable travel time for public to access. When? This is the penultimate work question. Well, I think now. We need to act now. We need to act to bend the curve of biodiversity loss in the face of land use change, climate. And David mentioned shifting baselines. We all have short lifetimes, I'm afraid, so, and we are at mercy of sort of every generation accepting what they knew as a child as being the norm. And of course that just takes us down the slippery slope. We need to reverse the shifting baseline syndrome. Who? Well, it's us. So these are my students in the Alps Field class. Obviously it's just a bunch of people, young people, I think, and that's the important thing. I'm looking around the room at the young people here. And so it's us, not the US. They seem to have gone down a bit of a bad alley just recently. But us, I think, is the answer. Now, this messes with my OCD. All of those were work questions. How doesn't fit. Maybe it should be a wow or something like that when we realise how we can do it. But this is my last slide. It's just saying how we can do this. Well, I think David was saying we need the Wild Places Index, and that needs to be rigorous, robust, repeatable, and reliable. The 4 R's of spatial analysis. But I think it's really interesting that the recent members' survey on wild places and the things that people said were made them wild to them. And in that list there, about, I can't see now, and I can't remember off the top of my head, but scenery, we talked about aesthetics, mental health and well-being. That's a tricky one to measure. The scenery we can measure. The health and well-being ones, it's more qualitative. Peace and solitude. We're just doing a piece of work for Lake District National Park now on tranquility mapping. So we can map tranquility based on detractors of it. Exposure to the elements. We've got great weather data, climate data. We can do that. What else have we got there? Sense of adventure. That's fine. Helen could tell us about that maybe. Clean air and water, biodiversity, wildlife spotting, all of these things are measurable. And I think we can build those into a wild places index. And this is some of the results from the Alan Turing work, which was done a couple of years ago for JMT. It's showing hotspots of wild places that many of us think are wild. So yeah, the how bit messes with my OCD a bit because it doesn't fit the pattern of WERS questions. But anyway. And I think taking it back to the international level, we do have the UN Global Biodiversity Framework, the Kunming-Montreal agreements, and the first three targets there are important. The first target was about participatory mapping, not what we've been talking about. The second target was to say we need to restore 30% of the world's degraded land, sea and water. And the third target, and this is out of 21 targets, sorry, the third target, I don't think they're in any particular order, but the third target was we need to protect 30% of the planet's high biodiversity land, sea and water areas. I think there's a role for the trust there in addressing the 30%.